They say there was a cook named Thomas Lawson, a merchant marine who served aboard Liberty ships during World War II, a man with no engineering credentials, no formal training, no authority to change anything. And yet, according to the story that survived 70 years, he invented something that the Navy's best scientists hadn't figured out. Something so simple, so ingenious, that it made Allied convoys nearly invisible to German U-boats. But here's where the story gets interesting. Nobody can find him, not in naval records, not in merchant marine archives, not in U.S., British, or Canadian military databases that have been meticulously cataloged and digitized since the end of the war. The story of Thomas Lawson, the cook who stopped U-boats from detecting convoys, exists everywhere on the internet, repeated across documentaries and YouTube videos and educational websites. The story is cited, retold, elaborated on, expanded with details and dialogue. But the man himself, he doesn't appear to exist. This is the investigation into that contradiction. Not to debunk a legend, but to understand why this particular myth emerged in the first place. Because the truth turns out to be far more complex and far more interesting than the fiction. The truth involves real men, real innovations, and a technological race that shaped the outcome of World War II. The truth involves the acoustic problem that was solved, just not the way the Lawson story claims. The question we need to answer is simple. What would drive a myth like this into existence? And the answer, it turns out, reveals something crucial about how technology actually defeats enemy weapons in wartime. Listen to Winston Churchill's own words, recorded in his memoirs after the war ended. "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war," he said, "was the U-boat peril." Think about that for a moment. Churchill had faced Nazi Germany's full military might. He'd watched London burn in the Blitz. He'd overseen the defense of Britain against invasion. He'd authorized campaigns that would cost thousands of lives. And yet, when he reflected on what truly terrified him, what kept him awake at night in his bunker, he didn't mention Hitler's armies. He didn't mention invasion threats or bombing campaigns. He mentioned submarines. U-boats. The reason was mathematics. Britain was an island nation, completely dependent on convoys bringing food, fuel, ammunition, and supplies across the Atlantic from America. Every merchant ship sunk meant fewer supplies reaching the home islands. Every convoy destroyed meant potential starvation or military defeat. By early 1943, German U-boats were sinking ships faster than they could be built. The arithmetic was brutal and unambiguous. If the Allies couldn't stop the U-boats, they couldn't win the war, and in March 1943, the U-boats were winning. They were winning so decisively that some military planners quietly wondered if the battle might already be lost. Convoy HX-229 sailed from New York in early March 1943, carrying 40 ships, slow freighters mostly. Liberty ships, mass-produced vessels built in American shipyards designed to carry cargo quickly and cheaply, not to survive in a war zone. The convoy was headed across the Atlantic toward Liverpool, a journey of roughly 2 weeks if all went well. 2 weeks in waters infested with German submarines. Convoy SC-122 sailed shortly after. Another collection of slow, lumbering cargo ships, moving together for mutual protection, hoping that there was safety in numbers. By March 16th, a German wolf pack, coordinated, U-boats under a central command, had found both convoys. What happened next was massacre. Ships were sunk so quickly that the convoy escorts couldn't respond fast enough to mount effective counterattacks. U-boats would fire their torpedoes and then dive, disappearing beneath the surface where sonar couldn't follow. The ships would die. Explosion, fire sinking into the freezing Atlantic, and by the time escorts reached the spot where they'd gone down, the U-boats were already gone, already repositioning for the next attack. In a single week, 22 merchant ships were destroyed. That's 567,000 gross tons of shipping lost. That's hundreds of tons of supplies at the bottom of the ocean. That's thousands of merchant sailors and military personnel either dead, burned, or dying from exposure in lifeboats. That's entire cargoes, ammunition, food, aviation fuel, military equipment. Gone. And it happened because the U-boats could hear the convoys coming from miles away. The problem was sound. Every ship makes noise underwater. The rumble of engines, the turning of propellers, the vibration of machinery transmitted through the hull into the surrounding water. For a U-boat, especially one equipped with advanced hydrophones, a merchant convoy sounded like a symphony announcing its presence across the Atlantic. German submarines didn't hunt by sight. They hunted by ear. U-boat captain could position his vessel miles away from a convoy, far beyond visual range, far beyond the range of surface ships' weapons, and still track it perfectly by listening to the mechanical noise. Hydrophones tuned to specific frequencies could pick up the distinctive sound of a Liberty ship's triple expansion steam engine. They could hear the peculiar acoustic signature of a freighter's propeller as it turned in the water, creating pressure waves that traveled for tremendous distances. The acoustic signature of a merchant convoy was like a beacon screaming, "Here we are, come and sink us," and the U-boats came. The reason convoy HX-229 and SC-122 were so devastated was because the ships made so much noise that German wolf packs could find them repeatedly, attack them repeatedly, and then disappear back into the darkness before the escorts could respond. The escorts, British and Canadian destroyers and corvettes, could deploy depth charges and search for U-boats on sonar, but by the time they located the submarines, the U-boats had already dived deep and repositioned. It was a fundamental mismatch. The Allies had speed and maneuverability on the surface. The Germans had acoustic advantage underwater. The Germans were hunting ships that sounded like thunderstorms in the acoustic environment. And the Allies couldn't solve the acoustic problem because it was inherent to how ships worked. Steam engines made noise. Propellers made noise. You couldn't operate a ship without creating the very acoustic signature that drew U-boats to you like moths to a flame. So, how do you solve an unsolvable problem? This is where the Thomas Lawson story usually enters. According to the legend, Lawson was a cook aboard a merchant ship. He supposedly noticed something that nobody else had figured out. What if you could muffle the ship's noise? What if you could isolate the machinery, decouple it from the hull, create barriers to prevent the acoustic energy from radiating into the surrounding water? The story says he filled sealed tanks with water-filled acoustic chambers, and had them installed around the ship's engine room. The theory, apparently, was that the water would absorb the sound energy, dampening the vibrations before they could travel through the hull into the ocean. According to the narrative, it worked. Detection range dropped from miles to hundreds of yards. U-boats could no longer find convoys by hydrophone alone. The acoustic advantage evaporated, and suddenly the equation shifted. Suddenly, convoys could operate with their escorts on high alert, able to respond to threats because they weren't being tracked from impossible distances by enemies they couldn't see. The story says Lawson's invention was adopted fleet-wide by July 1943. The story credits him with changing the Battle of the Atlantic. The story makes him a hero. But when you actually search for evidence of Thomas Lawson, when you dig into naval records, merchant marine archives, equipment manifests, and operational logs, you find something surprising. He doesn't exist. To understand why the myth became believable, you have to understand what was actually happening in the Atlantic in early 1943. You have to understand that the Allies were losing, not losing battles, losing the war itself. The war of arithmetic. The war of tonnage. The war of survival. A war in which every ship sunk represented not just lost cargo, but potentially lost hope. Churchill had said it clearly. The U-boat peril was the one thing that truly terrified him. And by March 1943, that terror was becoming justified. The numbers tell the story. In January 1943, German U-boats sank 186,000 tons of shipping. In February, 218,000 tons. In March, the number jumped to 327,000 tons. That's approaching 1 million tons of Allied shipping destroyed in 3 months. At that rate of loss, the Allies would run out of ships. At that rate of loss, Britain would starve. At that rate of loss, the invasion of Europe would become impossible. And all of this was happening because of sound. Because U-boats could hear. Merchant convoys before the convoys could see the U-boats. Because acoustic advantage meant tactical advantage. Because the fundamental physics of underwater sound propagation gave Germany's submarines a weapon that nobody knew how to counter. To understand this, you need to understand Liberty ships. A Liberty ship was an industrial miracle. The United States built over 2,700 of them during the war. They were designed to be constructed quickly, using welded steel rather than riveted construction, with interchangeable parts that could be fabricated in assembly lines. The average time to build a Liberty ship was about 1 month. Some were built in less than 2 weeks. They were also extraordinarily loud. A Liberty ship was powered by a triple expansion steam engine, a design that dated back to the 19th century, chosen because it was simple to manufacture and reliable. The engine produced tremendous vibration. Every revolution of the engine created mechanical stress that radiated through the ship's structure. The propeller, a single massive screw, 5.5 meters in diameter, turned in the water, creating cavitation bubbles and acoustic disturbances. A fully loaded Liberty ship, steaming across the Atlantic at its top speed of about 11 knots, generated an acoustic signature that, underwater, sounded like a thunderstorm mixed with industrial machinery. The noise was distinctive. The noise was powerful. The noise radiated through the water in all directions, traveling at the speed of sound in seawater, roughly 5 times faster than sound travels through air, and German U-boats could hear every bit of it. An A-type CIC U-boat, the most common German submarine of the war, was equipped with a hydrophone array. Hydrophones are essentially underwater microphones. They convert sound waves in water into electrical signals that can be amplified and analyzed. The U-boat's hydrophones could detect the acoustic signature of a merchant convoy from enormous distances. Typically, a U-boat could detect a noisy merchant convoy from between 5 and 20 kilometers away, depending on conditions. Let that sink in. 20 kilometers is about 12 nautical miles. That means a German U-boat could be 12 miles away, completely invisible, completely undetectable by any means available to convoy escorts, and still clearly hear the ships approaching. The U-boat captain could sit in his control room, listening to the distinctive mechanical signature of a merchant convoy, and know that ships were coming toward him at 11 knots. He had time to calculate, time to position his boat, time to maneuver into an attack position, time to prepare his torpedoes, time to choose which ships to target, time to conduct the entire tactical approach while the convoy was still beyond visual range, beyond radar range, beyond any means of detection that the escorts possessed. The acoustic advantage was absolute. Convoy HX-229 left New York on March 8, 1943. 40 merchant ships, a diverse collection of vessels from multiple nations, carrying supplies, ammunition, cargo of every conceivable type. The convoy was escorted by 5 ships, 3 Canadian corvettes and 2 other escorts. 5 ships to protect 40. It was a thin escort screen. It was always a thin escort screen. There simply weren't enough warships being built to provide adequate protection for every convoy. The convoy proceeded across the Atlantic on a southerly route, trying to avoid ice and weather. The merchant ships were cold, crowded, miserable. Merchant sailors didn't volunteer for this duty. They were conscripted, hired, ordered. Most of them understood that they were sailing into waters where German submarines hunted. Most of them knew that the casualty rate for merchant sailors exceeded the casualty rate for military personnel. When convoy HX-229 sailed, every man aboard knew there was a significant possibility he might die. They were right to be afraid. On March 16th, the convoy encountered a German wolf pack. A wolf pack wasn't a single U-boat. It was a coordinated group of submarines, sometimes as many as 15 or 20 operating under central command. German headquarters, tracking convoy movements via radio intercepts and position reports from individual U-boats, would coordinate the boat's movements to intercept high-value targets. A Wolf Pack would fan out across the convoy's expected route and wait. When one U-boat found the convoy, it would report the position, course, and speed. Other U-boats would move to intercept. What happened next was tactical slaughter. The first U-boat to attack would fire a volley of torpedoes at the convoy. Ships would explode and sink. Escorts would race toward the location of the attack, but the U-boat that had launched the torpedoes was already diving, already moving away. By the time the escorts arrived, the U-boat was gone, disappeared beneath the surface where the escorts couldn't follow effectively. And then another U-boat would attack from a different direction. The U-boat commanders were, in many respects, hunters in an ideal hunting environment. They could see their prey from enormous distances through sound. They could approach freely without being detected by diving. They could attack and then escape by submerging. They could repeat this process over and over again. The escort ships could drop depth charges, but depth charges required knowing exactly where the U-boat was. And by the time a U-boat was detected and attacked, it had usually moved far enough away that the depth charges missed. The convoy under attack was defenseless in the acoustic realm. The merchant ships made noise that announced their position. The escorts couldn't make the merchant ships quiet. The escorts could only hunt the U-boats that were attacking, and hunting U-boats is phenomenally difficult when the U-boats have the acoustic advantage. In the span of 6 days, Convoy HX-229 lost 5 ships. Convoy SC-122, which crossed similar waters slightly earlier, lost 17 ships. Together, the two convoys lost 327,000 tons of shipping. That's 22 merchant vessels destroyed. That's hundreds of lives lost. That's ammunition, food, fuel, military supplies at the bottom of the Atlantic. And it happened because German U-boats could hear the convoys coming. The acoustic problem wasn't subtle. It was explicit. It was documented. It was analyzed at the highest levels of command. The British Admiralty understood it. The U.S. Navy understood it. Everyone involved in convoy operations understood that the acoustic advantage was the fundamental problem that they had to solve. Meetings were held. Commissions were formed. Scientists were consulted. The Hugh Admiralty Research Laboratory in Teddington, England, was directed to investigate solutions. Similar investigations were launched in the United States. The question was direct. How do you make a ship quieter? And the honest answer was, with difficulty. With enormous difficulty. Possibly not at all. A ship is a mechanical system. A steam engine produces power by burning fuel and converting that energy into mechanical motion. That mechanical motion powers a propeller. The propeller pushes water. The engine vibrates. The machinery vibrates. The propeller creates cavitation and turbulence. All of these phenomena generate sound. To make a ship quieter, you would need to isolate the engine from the hull. You would need to decouple the machinery, install vibration isolation mounts, redesign the propeller, retrofit the ship with sound-absorbing materials. For new construction, these modifications might be feasible. For a ship already built and in service, retrofitting these changes would require bringing the ship out of service for months, essentially removing it from the war effort. Britain couldn't afford to remove merchant ships from service. They were needed constantly, running convoys continuously. Taking ships out of the water for acoustic modifications wasn't a viable strategy, so the problem seemed unsolvable through direct action. You couldn't make ships quiet enough to hide their acoustic signature. You couldn't modify enough ships quickly enough to change the overall problem. The acoustic disadvantage seemed like a fixed characteristic of naval warfare in 1943. This is the moment when a myth like Thomas Lawson becomes psychologically attractive. This is the moment when people, facing what seems like an unsolvable problem, might create a story about someone who solved it. Someone who saw a simple answer that the experts missed. Someone who invented something brilliant and elegant and effective. But the actual solution that emerged from this crisis was far more sophisticated. In spring 1943, several innovations reached maturity simultaneously. The first was an intelligence breakthrough. German U-boats communicated via radio. They transmitted position reports, requested tactical guidance, coordinated wolfpack movements. All of this communication was encrypted using the Enigma machine. But the transmission itself, the mere fact that a radio signal was being sent, could be detected and triangulated. The British had developed high-frequency direction finding equipment, abbreviated HF, DF, and pronounced Huff-Duff. The principle was straightforward. Detect a radio transmission on a specific frequency, and you can determine the bearing to the source. Install HF, DF. Equipment on multiple ships or shore stations, and you can triangulate the position. This was revolutionary. You didn't need to decode the message. You didn't need to know what the U-boat was saying. You just needed to know that it had transmitted, and you could determine its approximate location. A U-boat that reported its position to headquarters for tactical coordination essentially revealed its own position to the Allies. HF-DF stations started being installed on escort ships. HF-DF stations were established on shore at various points across the Atlantic. By April 1943, convoy commanders had access to HF-DF information that told them roughly where U-boats were operating. Suddenly, the acoustic advantage became less decisive. Yes, U-boats could still hear convoys from great distances, but the convoys now had information about where U-boats were located. Convoys could be routed around known U-boat positions. Escorts could maneuver in response to HF-DF intelligence. The acoustic problem, being heard from great distances, was becoming less critical if you already knew roughly where your attackers were. But HF-DF alone wasn't enough. The second innovation was aviation. In early 1943, escort carriers started being assigned to convoys. These were small converted merchant ships that could carry about 20 to 30 aircraft. They weren't powerful enough to fight capital ships, but they were powerful enough to project air power over a convoy. They could launch Wildcat fighters and Swordfish anti-submarine aircraft. An aircraft flying above a convoy could see far over the horizon. An aircraft could spot a U-boat surfacing for any reason. An aircraft could attack with depth charges or bombs or machine gun fire. A U-boat that encountered aircraft had to dive immediately, had to abandon any attack in progress, had to focus on escaping rather than hunting. The presence of air cover changed the tactical equation fundamentally. A U-boat that could hear a convoy from 12 miles away might spot the escorts from the surface. But if aircraft were present, the U-boat couldn't risk surfacing to make the best use of that acoustic advantage. The U-boat would be forced to stay submerged, operate on battery power, lose maneuverability. The acoustic advantage became almost irrelevant if the U-boat couldn't surface to exploit it. But there was a third piece to this puzzle, and it was the most technologically advanced of all. The question at the center of this investigation is deceptively simple. Did Thomas Lawson exist? But answering that question requires going much deeper than a simple yes or no. It requires understanding how historical records are maintained, how myths emerge, how truth and fiction interact in collective memory. It requires understanding that the absence of evidence isn't always evidence of absence, but in this particular case the absence is so complete, so thorough, that it tells its own story. Let's start with what we know about World War II naval records. Britain maintained meticulous documentation during the war, and has preserved those records with considerable care. The National Archives at Kew, outside London, hold over 200 miles of documents related to military operations. These records include convoy logs detailing every ship in every convoy, every reported sighting of enemy vessels, every engagement, equipment manifests listing every modification made to every ship, personnel records for both naval officers and merchant mariners, technical reports from the Admiralty Research Laboratory documenting every experiment conducted, casualty reports listing every death, every injury, every person reassigned. If Thomas Lawson existed as a merchant marine cook and participated in any way with an acoustic dampening retrofit, there would be records. Let's search for him. We start with basic merchant marine databases. During World War II, all merchant sailors serving on British and Allied merchant ships were registered. The records are extensive. They list names, ships served on, dates of service, casualty status. The databases have been digitized and are searchable. We search for Thomas Lawson, Tommy Lawson, variations on the name. Nothing. We search the merchant marine registers for all merchant sailors named Lawson who served in 1943. We find several sailors by that name, but none named Thomas, none with a first name that could be shortened to Tommy, none whose service record includes any mention of acoustic research or ship modifications. Search U.S. Navy records. The U.S. Navy maintained equally detailed records. We search maritime personnel databases. We search records related to merchant marine service under U.S. Navy administration. We search technical documentation from the Bureau of Ships. We search records from the Underwater Sound Laboratory at Yale, where much of the U.S. acoustic research was conducted. We find no record of Thomas Lawson. We find no record of a merchant cook involved in acoustic research. We find no record of water-filled acoustic chambers being tested or deployed on any merchant or naval vessel. We expand the search to CanadianRecords.Canada. Contributed significantly to convoy operations. Canadian ships escorted many convoys across the Atlantic. Canadian naval yards handled ship repairs and modifications. The National Archives of Canada maintain records of these operations. We search Canadian Naval Archives. We find no Thomas Lawson. We find no record of acoustic modification programs on merchant ships. We find documentation of acoustic research programs conducted by Canadian naval scientists, but these were theoretical investigations, not field implementations on merchant vessels. The absence of evidence is becoming conspicuous. The next step in the investigation is to search backward from the myth. Where did this story originate? We search historical publications, documentaries, educational websites. We try to trace the Lawson story back to its source. What we discover is fascinating. The story appears in various forms with different details in different sources. Some versions say the water-filled chambers were installed on a specific ship. Other versions are vaguer about the implementation. Some sources credit specific officers with approving the experiment. Other sources are unclear about the chain of command. This pattern, of a story that circulates widely but without a clear originating source, is the signature of an urban legend, or, in this case, a historical myth. Urban legends and historical myths typically follow a pattern. They contain a kernel of truth. They address a genuine concern or problem. They assign that solution to an authority figure or clever individual, and they get repeated so frequently that nobody bothers to verify the original source. The Thomas Lawson story fits this pattern perfectly. The kernel of truth. Merchant ship noise was a genuine military problem, the genuine concern. U-boats were finding and sinking convoys at catastrophic rates. The solution, an acoustic dampening system, plausible in principle, even if unverified in practice. The authority figure, a clever merchant marine cook, an underdog figure, relatable, believable. The widespread repetition. The story appears across documentaries and educational materials without anyone checking the source. What we need to do now is determine, where did the true solution actually come from? Let's investigate the actual acoustic research that occurred during 1943. The Admiralty Research Laboratory, located in Teddington, England, was where much of Britain's wartime acoustic research took place. The laboratory was directed by world-class scientists. The documentation from this laboratory is extensive and detailed. Every experiment conducted, every material tested, every design proposal was recorded. We search the Admiralty Research Laboratory records for acoustic dampening research in 1943. What we find is detailed documentation of sound propagation studies, analysis of how to reduce machinery noise on future ship designs, investigation of vibration isolation techniques. We find theoretical work. We find material testing. We find proposals for post-war applications. What we don't find is documentation of a water-filled acoustic chamber, retrofit program on merchant ships. We search the records of the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships. Similar pattern. Extensive documentation of acoustic research, proposals for future naval design modifications, investigation of decoupled machinery mounting systems. Nothing about water-filled chambers. Nothing about the Lawson system. We search records from the Underwater Sound Laboratory at Harvard and Yale. These laboratories conducted academic research on underwater acoustics during the war. The researchers included some of the world's leading acousticians. The documentation shows theoretical investigations, not field applications on merchant vessels. The picture becomes clear. Acoustic research was conducted, but it was primarily theoretical and design-oriented. The research was aimed at how to make future ships quieter, not at how to retrofit existing merchant vessels. No massive field implementation program existed. No water-filled acoustic chambers were deployed on convoys. The acoustic problem remained largely unsolved in the direct sense, but something else was happening, something much more interesting. Let's now search for the actual solutions. High-frequency direction finding, HF-DF, pronounced Huff-Duff. The British developed this technology in the early 1940s. The National Archives contain extensive documentation. Operating manuals exist. Training materials exist. Records show which escort ships received HF-DF equipment and when. The records show that HF-DF was being deployed on convoy escorts by early 1943, and it was being expanded rapidly through spring and summer of 1943. We have documentation of the specific vessels that received HF-DF equipment. We have tactical reports showing how HF-DF information was used to route convoys away from U-boat positions. We have post-war analyses showing the tactical impact of HF-DF on convoy operations. This is real. This is documented. This is undeniable. Let's search for escort carriers. The HMS Archer was the first escort carrier assigned to convoy operations. Records show her deployment, her aircraft complement, her operational effectiveness. The HMS Biter followed. Then the HMS Dasher. These ships were small, converted from other designs, not originally intended to carry aircraft. But they carried Swordfish and Wildcat aircraft that provided air cover for convoys. We have detailed records of specific encounters between escort carrier aircraft and U-boats. We have pilot reports describing attacking surfaced submarines. We have logs documenting when aircraft forced U-boats to dive, abandoning attacks on convoys. We have operational statistics showing the dramatic reduction in convoy losses in areas where escort carriers were deployed. This is real. This is documented. This is undeniable. Let's search for centimetric radar and the Leigh Light. Centimetric. Radar was one of the most closely guarded secrets of World War II. The technology gave the Allies an enormous advantage. The records were classified for decades. But post-war documentation, declassified over the years, provides extensive information about the development and deployment of centimetric radar. We find documentation of the research institutions where centimetric radar was developed: Radiation Laboratory at MIT, the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge, British research facilities. We find technical specifications. We find deployment records, showing which ships and aircraft received this equipment. We find operational reports describing engagements between Leigh Light-equipped aircraft and U-boats. Admiral Max Horton's records, preserved in naval archives, show his strategic thinking about how to integrate these new technologies into anti-submarine warfare tactics. Commander Peter Gretton's reports, preserved in British naval archives, show how he employed HF-DF information and escort carrier air support in his convoy operations. These are the real people. These are the real innovations. These are the real solutions. And they are incomparably more interesting than the myth of Thomas Lawson. The breakthrough insight comes when we understand what actually happened in April and May of 1943. 3 technologies reached operational maturity at roughly the same time. 1. HF-DF was deployed fleet-wide on convoy escorts. 2. Escort carriers with aircraft were becoming standard on high-value convoys. 3. Centimetric radar and Leigh Light systems were being distributed to operational squadrons. These 3 technologies, when integrated, created a fundamental shift in the balance of power in the Atlantic. We have documentation of Admiral Horton's strategic thinking during this period. His records show that he understood the convergence. He understood that the 3 technologies working together would change the tactical equation. He understood that the acoustic advantage U-boats had possessed would become irrelevant if U-boats couldn't operate freely. His orders to convoy commanders reflected this understanding. He began coordinating HF-DF intelligence with operational decisions about convoy routing and escort placement. He made sure that aircraft were deployed in concert with surface escorts. He ensured that centimetric radar information was integrated into tactical planning. The result was something remarkable. In May 1943, Black May, German U-boats suffered their catastrophic losses. 41 submarines sunk in a single month, the turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic. The moment when Germany lost the initiative in the Atlantic and never regained it. This didn't happen because ships were made quieter. This happened because U-boats were made unable to hunt freely. The acoustic problem was solved not by addressing acoustics directly, but by changing the operational environment so fundamentally that acoustic advantage became strategically irrelevant. This is the crucial insight that explains why the Lawson myth exists. The Thomas Lawson story is completely fictional. No merchant marine cook by that name exists in the records. No water-filled acoustic dampening system was ever deployed. No retrofit program was ever conducted on Liberty ships. The story is fabricated. It's a myth, pure and simple. But the myth exists for a reason. The myth exists because the underlying problem, the acoustic crisis, was real and profound. The myth exists because the solution seemed magical to people who didn't understand the technology. Direction finding that could locate invisible transmitters, aircraft that could illuminate targets in darkness, radar that could see through fog and night. The myth exists because in an era before technical knowledge was widespread, a story about a brilliant cook solving an impossible problem was more emotionally satisfying than the complex truth about technological integration and strategic thinking. The myth exists because the real people involved, the scientists, the engineers, the naval officers who coordinated the solution, often don't get recognized in popular history. But now we have the real story. Now we understand what actually happened. And the real story is far more instructive, far more important, and far more interesting than any myth. Now that we've established what didn't happen, that Thomas Lawson and his acoustic system never existed, we need to understand what actually did happen. The real solutions that emerged from the acoustic crisis of 1943 were far more interesting, far more sophisticated, and far more revolutionary than any fictional water-filled chamber system. These were innovations that represented the cutting edge of wartime technology. These were solutions that required coordinating science, engineering, and tactical thinking across multiple domains. Let's start with the first piece of the puzzle: radio direction finding. A German U-boat sitting at sea faces an essential problem. How do you stay coordinated with headquarters, The submarine needs to report its location and current tactical situation. It needs torsive orders. It needs to coordinate with other U-boats in the Wolf Pack. All of this communication happens via radio. The U-boat surfaces, raises its radio antenna, transmits its message, then submerges again. A radio transmission is, by definition, electromagnetic radiation traveling through space. Electromagnetic radiation can be detected even if the content of the transmission is encrypted and unreadable. The fact that a transmission occurred at a particular frequency, at a particular time, from a particular location, can be determined through direction-finding equipment. The principle of direction finding is centuries old. It's based on electromagnetic wave propagation. Transmit from location A, and anyone with direction-finding equipment can determine the bearing to your transmitter by analyzing the signal strength and direction. During World War II, the Allies understood this principle perfectly. British engineers, working at the General Radio Company's laboratory and other facilities, developed high-frequency direction-finding equipment specifically tuned to the frequencies used by German U-boats for radio communication. HF-DF equipment could detect a U-boat transmission and determine the bearing to the source. Install HF-DF equipment on multiple ships, and you could triangulate the position of the U-boat. The beauty of this system was that it didn't require breaking the encryption. It didn't require understanding the content of the message. It just required knowing that a transmission had occurred. By early 1943, British destroyers and corvettes escorting convoys were being equipped with HF-DF gear. The installation was not particularly complex: an antenna array, air-receiver tuned to U-boat frequencies, and a display showing bearing information. A trained operator could interpret the display and determine the direction to a transmitting U-boat. Convoy commanders received this information in real time. Let me paint a picture of how this changed the tactical situation. Previously, a convoy was sailing blind in the acoustic environment. U-boats could har the convoy from miles away and approach at will. The escorts had no way to know where the U-boats were or how many there were. With HF-DF, that changed. A U-boat reports its position to headquarters for tactical coordination. The HF-DF operator on the escort vessel detects the transmission. Within minutes, the convoy commander knows that a U-boat has just transmitted from a specific bearing. The convoy commander uses this information to maneuver the convoy away from the reported bearing. The convoy steers a course that takes it away from where the U-boat was detected. This doesn't completely solve the acoustic problem. U-boats can still hear the convoy, but now the convoy has a tactical advantage it didn't have before: early warning of U-boat presence and rough position information. And if multiple escorts have HF-DF equipment and can triangulate the signal, the position information becomes more precise. Now let's consider the second piece: escort carriers and Airpower. A U-boat operates most effectively when it's fully submerged. Submerged, it's invisible to surface ships. Submerged, it can be attacked by depth charges but not easily. Submerged, it maintains the psychological advantage that comes from being invisible. But a U-boat can't remain fully submerged indefinitely. U-boats of the era used diesel engines for surface propulsion and electric batteries for submerged propulsion. The electric batteries had limited range. The diesel engines couldn't be run while submerged, so a U-boat had to surface periodically to run its diesel engines and recharge its batteries. A U-boat also had to surface to maintain radio contact with headquarters. A U-boat had to surface to conduct visual reconnaissance. When a U-boat surfaced, it became vulnerable. A surfaced U-boat could be spotted by an aircraft from miles away. An aircraft could approach, could drop depth charges, could strafe with machine gun fire. A U-boat that encountered an aircraft had to dive immediately, had to abandon any tactical operation in progress, had to focus on escape. By early 1943, escort carriers were being assigned to high-value convoys. These small carriers couldn't fight capital ships. They weren't warships designed for fleet combat, but they could carry 20 to 30 aircraft, and those aircraft could project power over a convoy. An escort carrier with a complement of Swordfish anti-submarine aircraft could provide air cover for a convoy. The Swordfish was slow. Its maximum speed was about 140 miles per hour, which was barely faster than a sailing ship, but it was rugged and designed specifically for anti-submarine operations. It could carry depth charges, bombs, or torpedo. A Wildcat fighter aircraft could provide air cover and conduct attacks on surfaced U-boats. The presence of air cover changed the tactical environment fundamentally. U-boats that might have conducted surface attacks in clear daylight now had to consider whether aircraft would be present. U-boats that planned to shadow a convoy on the surface had to consider whether air patrols would spot them. U-boats that needed to surface to charge batteries had to take the risk that an aircraft might be nearby. And in May 1943, when escort carriers were deployed more widely and aircraft patrol frequency increased, U-boats suffered casualties at unprecedented rates. Aircraft attacks on U-boats increased from occasional occurrences to regular tactical events. U-boat losses to air attack jumped dramatically. U-boat captains who had previously felt relatively secure on the surface now felt hunted. The psychological effect on U-boat morale was profound. Now let's consider the third and most technologically advanced piece: centimetric radar and the Leigh Light. Radar was a technology still in its infancy during World War II. Early radar systems operated at wavelengths measured in meters. These systems could detect large objects at substantial distances, but resolution was poor. You could detect that something was there, but determining exactly what it was or how big it was proved difficult. By 1943, radar technology had advanced to centimetric wavelengths measured in centimeters rather than meters. This advance required new microwave tubes, new antenna designs, new electronic systems. But the advantages were revolutionary. Centimetric radar could detect small objects at precise ranges and bearings. Centimetric radar could be installed on escort ships and aircraft. Centimetric radar could function at night and in fog, conditions where visual spotting was impossible. A radar operator on an escort ship could detect a surfaced U-boat at night or in fog, something that wouldn't be possible through visual means. An aircraft equipped with centimetric radar could conduct a search pattern over the ocean, scanning for any radar target that might be a surfaced submarine. When a target was detected, the aircraft could approach the target. But here's where it got clever. A simple radar system on an aircraft could guide the aircraft to the general vicinity of the target, but couldn't provide the precise targeting information needed for an accurate attack. So the British developed the Leigh Light, a powerful searchlight mounted on anti-submarine aircraft. The radar would detect a U-boat. The aircraft would approach, guided by the radar signal. At close range, the pilot would switch on the Leigh Light, an incredibly powerful xenon lamp that could illuminate an area for miles. The U-boat, which had been unaware that it was being tracked, would suddenly be exposed in blinding white light. The U-boat would dive immediately, desperately, in a panicked response, but diving meant losing battery power. Diving meant becoming immobilized. Diving meant abandoning any tactical operation and focusing on escape. The Leigh Light was psychological warfare as much as it was tactical innovation. U-boat crews became terrified of night operations. U-boat captains became extremely cautious about surfacing in areas where air patrols were active. What makes the convergence of these three technologies revolutionary is what happened when they were integrated into a coordinated system. Imagine, you're a U-boat captain in May 1943. You're receiving orders from headquarters to intercept convoy HX 230. You know the approximate location where the convoy should be, based on intelligence and reports from other boats. You maneuver your U-boat to intercept. But before you can get close enough for a surface attack, your radio detection equipment picks up an HF-DF transmission. You realize that you've been detected. You know that your position is now compromised. Do you attempt to attack despite the risk, or do you maneuver to avoid the convoy? You decide to maneuver, but now, even as you maneuver away, you spot an aircraft in the distance. The aircraft is conducting air patrol over the convoy. You're forced to dive. You submerge to escape the aircraft, but diving means you can't maintain radio contact, can't coordinate with other boats, can't shadow the convoy. Your batteries are running low from recent operations. You need to surface and run your diesel engines to recharge. You wait, watching through your periscope. The aircraft patrol seems to have passed. You surface. You're suddenly illuminated by the Leigh Light. Blinding white light so intense that you can barely see. Machine gun fire rakes your hull. You dive desperately, abandoning the attempt to charge your batteries, focusing purely on escape. You've gone from being a hunter in an ideal hunting environment to being prey in an increasingly hostile environment. This is what changed in May 1943. This is why 41. U-boats were sunk. This is why German U-boat command went into crisis mode. Admiral Max Horton understood this convergence. Clearly, Horton was the British admiral commanding Western Approaches Command, the unit responsible for protecting convoys in the Atlantic. His records, preserved in naval archives, show that he explicitly understood that HFDF, escort carrier aircraft, and radar were creating a new tactical environment that was fundamentally more favorable to convoys than to U-boats. He issued orders that integrated these technologies into a coordinated system. HFDF. Information would be shared in real time with convoy commanders, who would use it to route convoys away from detected U-boats. Aircraft patrols would be coordinated with HFDF information to intercept U-boats rather than just react to them. Radar information would be integrated into tactical planning. This coordination didn't happen automatically. It required conscious strategic thinking. It required communication between different units and different types of commanders: surface naval officers, aviation commanders, radar specialists, signals intelligence personnel. It required creating procedures for sharing information in real time. It required training commanders to understand how to use the new technologies. But once the system was in place, the results were dramatic. U-boat losses in May 1943 were catastrophic because the Allies had created a tactical environment where the U-boat's advantages had been largely neutralized and the Allies' advantages had been amplified. This is the real story of acoustic warfare in 1943. Not a merchant marine cook inventing a silencing system, but a sophisticated convergence of technologies that solved the problem indirectly. Not a simple innovation, but a complex integration of multiple systems. Not a single brilliant moment, but a sustained effort by scientists, engineers, and naval commanders working together. The investigation reveals something profound about how technological innovation actually works in practice. The acoustic problem seemed direct. Ships are too loud. U-boats can hear them. Therefore, ships need to be made quieter, but the actual solution was indirect. U-boats can hear ships, but U-boats also need to transmit radio signals, and transmitting radio signals reveals their position. U-boats also need to surface periodically, and surfaced U-boats are vulnerable to aircraft. U-boats that surface are vulnerable to radar detection and Leigh Light illumination. Therefore, if you make it so U-boats can't operate freely, the acoustic advantage becomes irrelevant. The lesson is this: sometimes the solution to an unsolvable problem isn't to solve it directly. Sometimes the solution is to change the context so fundamentally that the problem becomes irrelevant. Sometimes the solution is to attack adjacent problems in such a way that the original problem loses its significance. This is a lesson that applies far beyond naval warfare. It applies to business problems, to scientific challenges, to technical innovation of all kinds. When a direct solution seems impossible, look for ways to change the context, to attack adjacent problems, To create an environment where the original problem becomes irrelevant. The myth of Thomas Lawson exists because people want an example of direct innovation, a simple solution to a complex problem. The reality of HFDF, escort carriers, and centimetric radar exists because that's how innovation actually works. In the real world, a sophisticated integration of multiple technologies addressing different aspects of a problem. We've now established that Thomas Lawson didn't exist. We've confirmed that acoustic dampening retrofit systems weren't deployed on merchant ships. We've found detailed documentation of the actual solutions that solved the acoustic crisis: radio direction finding, escort carrier aircraft, centimetric radar, and the Leigh Light. But this raises a deeper question. Why does the Lawson myth persist? Why do people repeat a story that's completely fictional? Why has this myth become embedded in documentaries, educational materials, and historical narratives? The answer requires understanding something about how human beings relate to history, to innovation, and to the stories we tell ourselves about the past. The truth is that the real story is more complex than the myth. The real story requires understanding radio direction finding, understanding how radar works, understanding aircraft operations, understanding electronic systems, understanding tactical integration. The real story requires technical knowledge. The real story requires engagement with complexity. The myth of Thomas Lawson is simpler. A man sees a problem. A man thinks of a solution. A man builds the solution. The problem is solved. The solution is deployed. Lives are saved. This is a narrative arc that every human being understands intuitively. It's the hero's journey applied to technical innovation. It's emotionally satisfying in a way that discussions of technological integration aren't. We are drawn to stories like Thomas Lawson because they confirm something we want to believe about human ingenuity: that brilliant individuals can solve seemingly unsolvable problems through insight and creativity, that expertise and education aren't always necessary, that an outsider, a cook, not an engineer, can sometimes see something that trained experts miss. There's psychological power in that narrative. It's aspirational. It's egalitarian. It's emotionally resonant. The real story, by contrast, is about institutional knowledge, about scientists working in laboratories, about engineers designing systems, about military officers coordinating multiple technologies, about the power of formal education, training, and systematic research, about how solutions emerge from complex organizational structures, not from brilliant individuals. Which story do we want to believe? Which story do we find more compelling? For many people, the answer is obvious. We want to believe in the Thomas Lawson story. But here's the crucial insight. Recognizing the myth doesn't diminish the reality. If anything, understanding that Thomas Lawson is fictional and understanding what actually happened makes the real story more impressive, more important, and more instructive than the myth. Consider what actually had to happen for the acoustic crisis to be solved. Scientists at multiple institutions had to conduct research on radio direction finding. Engineers had to design HFDF equipment. This equipment had to be manufactured in quantities necessary to outfit convoy escorts. Training programs had to be developed so that operators could use HFDF effectively. Simultaneously, escort carriers had to be designed and built. Aircraft specifically designed for anti-submarine operations had to be developed and produced. Pilots had to be trained. Maintenance crews had to be trained. Aircraft had to be integrated into convoy operations alongside surface escorts, which required developing new tactics and procedures for coordinated air-surface operations. Simultaneously, centimetric radar had to be developed from theoretical physics through engineering design through manufacturing. The Leigh Light system had to be invented and integrated with radar. Aircraft had to be modified to carry this equipment. Pilots had to be trained to use it. The technology had to be deployed to operational squadrons. All of this had to happen while the war was ongoing. All of this had to be coordinated across multiple nations and military branches. All of this had to be integrated into a coherent tactical system. And all of this had to happen under conditions of extreme scarcity. Resources that went into developing these systems couldn't go into other military programs. Time that scientists and engineers spent on these projects couldn't be spent elsewhere. Manufacturing capacity was limited. Everything was constrained. Yet the Allies accomplished all of this in a span of less than a year. The myth of Thomas Lawson, one man, one solution, is actually less impressive than the reality of how the acoustic crisis was actually solved. The reality demonstrates the power of institutional knowledge and formal research, the importance of coordinating multiple technologies and multiple organizations, the strategic thinking required to integrate new technologies into effective systems, the human coordination and leadership needed to make complex innovation work, the time, resources, and effort required for real technological breakthroughs. All of this is more impressive than any fictional individual genius moment. So why does the Lawson myth persist despite all of this? The answer is that myths and truth serve different psychological purposes. A myth provides closure. A myth provides a clear narrative. A myth answers the question, "What did we do?" with a simple story. We deployed an acoustic silencing system. Truth provides understanding. Truth provides complexity. Truth answers the question, "How did we solve the problem?" with a nuanced explanation involving multiple technologies and multiple organizations. Both have value, but we tend to prefer myths because myths are easier to remember, easier to retell, easier to understand, easier to believe. A generation grows up learning the Lawson story. They pass it to the next generation. The story gets repeated in documentaries, in educational materials, in online sources. Each repetition adds credibility, even though the underlying story is fictional. Eventually, the fictional story becomes what people know about the acoustic problem, even though it's false. This is how myths become embedded in collective historical knowledge. This is how fiction becomes accepted as truth. And it happens not because people are stupid or credulous, but because myths serve psychological and narrative purposes that truth often doesn't. But here's what this investigation offers: an opportunity to embrace truth without losing the narrative power that myths provide. The real story of how HF-DF, escort carriers, and centimetric radar converged to solve an unsolvable problem is just as narratively compelling as the Lawson myth. It's a story of heroic effort by scientists and engineers working under pressure. It's a story of strategic thinking by military leaders who understood that multiple technologies had to work together to solve a complex problem. It's a story of human ingenuity applied in context of extreme challenge. It's a story of how formal knowledge, research institutions, and coordinated organizational effort can accomplish seemingly impossible things. It's a story worth telling. It's a story worth believing. And unlike the Lawson myth, it's a story that's actually true. The investigation into the Thomas Lawson myth teaches us something important about how we should engage with historical narratives. It teaches us that it's worth asking questions, it's worth checking sources, it's worth searching for documentation, it's worth tracing stories back to their origins. Because when we do that work, we often discover that the truth is more interesting, more complex, and ultimately more important than the myths we've inherited. The Lawson investigation shows us that truth requires effort. Understanding the actual solutions to the acoustic crisis requires learning about radio direction finding, about centimetric radar, about escort carrier operations, about naval tactics and strategy. It's harder than simply saying, "A cook invented a silencing system," but it's worth the effort because the truth actually teaches us something. The truth teaches us that problems are solved through coordinated effort, through multiple innovations, through strategic thinking, through the integration of technologies and tactics. That's a lesson that applies not just to World War II, but to how we solve problems today. Now we move to the legacy, because the story of acoustic warfare doesn't end in 1943. The investigation into the Thomas Lawson myth has taken us through the acoustic crisis, through the search for truth, through the real solutions. But the story doesn't end in 1943, because the problem that seemed unsolvable in 1943 remains a problem in 2024. The context changes. The technology changes. The players change, but the fundamental challenge persists. After World War II ended, naval officers and scientists recognized that the acoustic problem wouldn't go away. In fact, it would become more important. Because submarines were becoming more sophisticated. U-boats had been relatively slow, relatively loud, relatively predictable. Post-war submarines, particularly Soviet submarines, would be faster, quieter, more capable. The acoustic environment would become even more critical to naval warfare. The question became, how do you make a ship less detectable acoustically? The direct answer, making ships quieter, remained challenging but became more feasible. New ship designs incorporated acoustic dampening materials. Machinery was mounted on vibration isolation systems. Propellers were redesigned to reduce cavitation noise. But there was another approach that emerged. What if you couldn't make ships quieter, but you could mask the noise that was being generated? What if you introduced noise at frequencies that interfered with the noise signature of the ship? What if you created an acoustic environment so complex that your ship's acoustic signature became impossible to isolate? This concept led to the development of the Prairie Masker system. Prairie Masker was developed by the U.S. Navy in the 1950s and deployed starting in the 1960s. The concept: install small holes in the hull of a ship and pump air through these holes, creating a curtain of bubbles around the ship's hull. These bubbles would absorb and scatter acoustic energy, making the ship effectively silent to acoustic. Detection: it was elegant, was effective. It represented the application of the principle that we saw in 1943. Don't try to solve the acoustic problem directly by making machinery quieter, but rather by changing the acoustic environment so that detection becomes difficult. Prairie Masker was revolutionary when deployed. Soviet submarines equipped with sophisticated acoustic sensors found themselves unable to detect American ships equipped with Prairie Masker systems. American submarines could approach closely without being detected. The acoustic advantage had shifted again, but only for a time. Because as soon as the Soviets understood how Prairie Masker worked, they began developing countermeasures. They developed more sophisticated sonar systems. They developed acoustic analysis techniques that could identify ships through Prairie Masker masking. They developed their own masking systems. The acoustic arms race continued, and it continues to this day. Modern naval warfare is, in many respects, an acoustic battle. Submarines try to remain silent. Surface ships try to detect submarines. Both sides deploy sophisticated acoustic systems, acoustic countermeasures, acoustic analysis techniques. Modern submarines are extraordinarily quiet, so quiet that they're almost impossible to detect acoustically at long ranges. Modern sonar systems are extraordinarily sophisticated, capable of detecting tiny acoustic anomalies and identifying ship types from acoustic signatures. The acoustic environment has become so complex that understanding it requires specialized knowledge of acoustic propagation, sonar technology, signal processing, and of all tactics, the question that Thomas Lawson supposedly solved in 1943, how do you hide from acoustic detection, remains a central question in modern naval warfare, but it's being solved not through the direct answer that the myth suggests, but through the sophisticated indirect approaches that the real history shows. Modern warships incorporate acoustic dampening materials, vibration isolation systems, and hull designs that reduce acoustic output. Modern submarines use Prairie Masker variants and other acoustic masking systems. Modern sonar includes advanced signal processing that can overcome many acoustic countermeasures. Of this reflects the lesson we learned in 1943. Solving. An acoustic problem doesn't necessarily mean solving it directly. It means changing the acoustic environment, developing countermeasures, creating systems that work around the problem rather than through it. The investigation into the Thomas Lawson myth reveals something profound about innovation, about historical truth, and about how problems are actually solved in their world. The myth suggests that brilliant individuals solve problems. The reality shows that complex problems are solved through coordinated technological and tactical innovation, through research institutions, through military strategy, through the integration of multiple systems. The myth suggests that once a problem is solved, it stays solved. The reality shows that solutions generate new challenges, that adversaries develop countermeasures, that the problem-solving never ends. It just evolves to higher levels of sophistication. The myth suggests that history is simple. The reality shows that history is complex, that truth requires effort to uncover, that understanding the past provides lessons for the future. Why does this matter in 2024? It matters because we're facing similar challenges today. We're developing sophisticated technologies to accomplish military objectives. We're deploying artificial intelligence, quantum computing, advanced sensors, electronic warfare systems. All of these are being integrated into defense systems and strategies. The lesson from the acoustic crisis and the Thomas Lawson myth is this: beware of myths about technological silver bullets. Beware of stories about single brilliant innovations that solve everything. Understand that real solutions come from coordinated effort, from integrating multiple technologies and approaches, from strategic thinking about how different systems work together. Understand that once you develop a solution to a problem, adversaries will develop countermeasures. The problem-solving never ends. Understand that formal knowledge, research institutions, and organized effort are what actually accomplish technological breakthroughs, not individual genius moments, and perhaps most importantly, understand that the truth about how technology actually works is more interesting, more complex, and ultimately more important than the myths we tell ourselves. The Lawson myth will probably persist. People will continue to repeat the story of the cook who invented an acoustic silencing system. But now, those who understand the truth have a choice: perpetuate the myth or share the truth. And sharing the truth means engaging in the same kind of investigation, the same kind of critical thinking, the same kind of effort to understand complex reality that we've undertaken. Here, that's the real legacy of this investigation, not that Thomas Lawson didn't exist, but that truth-seeking matters, that understanding how technologies actually work is important, that myths, while psychologically satisfying, are no substitute for the complex, difficult, ultimately more rewarding task of understanding what actually happened, and that the future will be shaped not by those who believe comforting myths, but by those who have the courage to seek difficult truths,